I love a good ghost story. When I was younger, there were these series of books called Haunted Philippines and True Philippine Ghost Stories that contained ghost stories and paranormal experiences from various people across the country. Some stories were in English, while the rest were in Tagalog. They were quick to read and had numerous volumes. Sometimes they even had a section of ghost pictures near the end. You know the kind. Nonchalant landscape or family pics with a blurry figure circled in red. Some of them actually looked quite convincing and downright creepy. I loved that series, though I should have enjoyed them more while they lasted. As of last year, they seem to have been discontinued and they're difficult to find in bookstores now. To me, these books were just good entertainment. Growing up in the Philippines provided no shortage of ghost stories and mythical legends. It seemed like everyone had a story to tell, or knew someone who had one. I've had a handful of relatives in my family who claim to have had encounters with a ghost, or multo, as we call them in our native tongue. I never thought that I would have one of my own stories to share, but that changed very recently. My family and I had recently taken a trip back to the Philippines. It was long overdue, as I had not seen my relatives and my home country in several years. It was a bit strange to see all my younger cousins growing up. It was a great experience just to see them all again and spend time with them. On our first week there, we were on our way back to my aunt's house from a long day of shopping when the conversation in the car turned to supernatural stuff. Our culture is heavy on religion and tradition, and we can be very superstitious at times. There are numerous stories of mythical monsters in Filipino culture, and hearing about them from my parents and relatives only furthered my interest. They included stories of the Tikbalang, which was a monster that frequented the forests in the mountains. It's described as a large, humanoid creature with the head and limbs of a horse. Then there's the Kapre. That's more of a tale for kids. It's described as a tall, troll-like thing that resides in large trees where it will sit and smoke a cigar, waiting to scare off little children that are out too late at night. He's usually known as non-violent though. Another one is a Tiyanak. They are the stuff of nightmares. In remote areas, nearby forests, you could hear the faint crying of a baby. If you followed those sounds deep into the woods, it could lead you to becoming perpetually lost. Or if you were really unlucky, you would find the source. You would stumble upon what looks like a baby on the ground, but in reality, it is a small, ghastly creature that will transform and eat you. Then there is the Aswang, a shapeshifter that feeds on human flesh at night. A specific species of them, called a manananggal, which translates literally to remover, is a particularly terrifying one. By day, they are in the form of a regular woman, but by night, they feed. They root their legs to the ground as their top half detaches itself, sprouts bat-like wings, and takes flight. They are known to mainly target pregnant women. They have this long, vine-like tongue that slithers down and eats the fetus as they hover right outside the window. I know, pretty crazy stuff, right? I've always regarded these tales with a healthy amount of salt and a full dose of fear. They were cool and unique, but I could happily live the rest of my life not encountering any of them, if they were indeed real. Even when I moved away, I was still wary of those regional creatures. Anyways, during the car ride, my cousins spoke of strange sightings and experiences that they've all had, all with varying degrees of believability and silliness. My dad relayed some tales from his younger years about how his group of friends would encounter this and that. He was always ever so dramatic with his storytelling. It was all in good fun, but throughout the whole conversation, my mum remained quiet. She was the hard skeptic type. She would always dismiss those stories as silly folklore. However, at that moment, it looked like she had something to say. My curiosity took over, and I finally asked her if she had had any ghostly encounters. She looked at me, and she nodded. Back during her college years, when she was studying to be a nurse, she lived on campus of a very old school, not too far from the city that I was born in. Living conditions were pretty rough. 4 of them had to share a room half the size of a normal college dorm. On top of that, the campus used to be an infirmary during World War II. Hundreds of soldiers from both sides of the war passed through and died within those walls. Residents of the dorm would speak of strange noises in the night. Footsteps, faint echoes and knocking were heard in certain parts of the building. There were rumors that the place was also a temporary orphanage at one point in time, and that a handful of children had died there. They said that you could hear the children's laughter in the walls if you listened really closely. On more than one occasion, my mum and her roommates would wake up to faint shuffling noises in the room, like someone small was moving around. When they looked around, they would never see anyone, so they just dismissed it and went back to sleep. It wouldn't be until the following morning that they saw what looked like footprints on the walls and ceiling. They were the size of a child's feet. One of her roommates moved out after that. One night, a close friend of my mum's was heading back to her room after a late-night study session. She was wary of the supernatural, so she kept her head down and walked quickly through the halls. As she passed by one of the empty rooms, something caught her eye. That large room used to be a triage area when the place was still a hospital. The old rusted beds were all left there, abandoned, and the room was used for storage. She said she saw a half-dozen men lying on the beds. They looked injured and bandaged, and they wore what looked like the uniform of an American soldier from World War II. She stood frozen in place as she felt the coldest chill she'd ever experienced in her life. Then, one of the soldiers sat straight up and slowly turned towards her. That was enough to snap her back to her senses, and she took off running towards her room. When she got to her dorm and told her friends what she saw, the brave ones of the group headed to the room to investigate. When they got there, the beds were, of course, empty. Ever the skeptic, my mum didn't put much stock in these stories. That is, until early one morning, when she experienced something that challenged her stance and still bothers her to this day. In the mornings before classes, my mum would wake up extra early so she could get first dibs on the showers in the community bathrooms. It wasn't too hard, since a lot of the residents had convinced themselves that the place really was haunted, and they were unwilling to venture out on their own that early. My mum mostly ignored those stories, and she always got to class early. That morning, she did her usual routine and it went off without a hitch. As she was walking back to her room, she heard it. She said it sounded like whispers. She stopped and turned around. Down the hallway, a figure stood just at the edge of the darkness. The lights weren't in the best condition in that wing, so it was dim. Still though, my mum could discern that the figure was dressed like a nun. That didn't make any sense, since there were no nuns on campus, and the nearest church was several miles away. Staying completely calm, my mum turned and walked away. She quickened her pace and her own footsteps echoed in the empty hall. She strained to hear any other noises, but she heard none. When she turned right into another hallway, she saw the nun from the corner of her eye. It was closer, definitely following her. As she got closer to her dorm, she turned around once more. The nun was at the end of the hall, just as far away from her as when she first saw it. The nun stood still, as if she had been standing there the whole time. My mum quickly reached her door and struggled to unlock it. Daring one last look, she turned to her left, but the nun was gone. Relieved, she turned the lock. As she did, she moved to pick up her stuff and felt an unnaturally cold chill. She slowly looked right, and it was right there. The nun, on the other end of the hall. Except now, she was much closer and fully in the light. On instinct, my mum turned the knob and threw her door open. And that's when the child ran out. A small, kindergarten-aged child ran out of her dorm room, brushed past her leg, and ran towards the nun. The child was laughing innocently, as if playing a game of tag. My mum watched as the child ran past the nun and disappeared into another room. After a few moments, the nun turned and followed the child. My mum asked around after that experience and learned that the last time there were children or nuns in the campus was back when it was a temporary orphanage several years ago. They had shut it down after a tragic fire killed a dozen children and a few nuns looking after them. She never experienced anything else out of the ordinary after that. After she told that story, we all sat stunned in our seats. Mum had been holding out on us. I was thrilled, but also a little terrified of what I'd just heard. See, at the time, I had a passive interest in the paranormal. It wasn't anything serious and nowhere near obsession levels. It's not like I was out to prove that the afterlife existed or find evidence that ghosts and spirits were real, to try and find some sort of meaning in this chaotic world. Did I believe in the supernatural? Not really. But I would be open to the possibility. My interest in the subject was purely recreational, like someone who enjoys horror movies or knitting sweaters. In fact, while I like reading up on urban legends and I enjoy hearing ghost stories, I'm also terrified by them. My imagination, fueled by stuff I've read and scary movies I've watched, would always get the best of me whenever I was alone in the dark. It was a sort of interesting paradox. Kind of like how at one point in my childhood I was fascinated by snakes as animals, but I was also deathly afraid of encountering one out in the wild. To be honest, I was still a little bit jealous of my mum that she had such a cool story to tell. I wished at that moment I had my own story. Well, you know what they say about being careful what you wish for. Later on in the trip, we visited my uncle who lived a few towns over. There, he lived with his family, where he ran a very lucrative farming business. On the way there, we passed over a long bridge that went over a steep ravine with a river below. As our car rode along the bridge, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. It made sense, since I'd travelled over this bridge many times before, whenever I would visit my uncle and cousins. However, underneath that feeling of nostalgia was a sense of unadulterated fear and dread. Like something bad had happened here, and it somehow directly affected me. A distant memory, screaming to be remembered. As if on cue, my dad pointed out that this bridge was infamous to the surrounding towns and cities because of the White Lady. Just like the Capre or the Tikbalang, the White Lady is another one of the ghost stories told all around the country. She is, perhaps, the most well-known, since different countries also have their own version. In America, she's usually called the Lady in White. In Spanish culture, she's La Llorona. The basic idea remains the same. A ghostly-looking woman wearing a long white dress with long dark hair stands on the side of isolated roads, waiting to hitch a ride. The scenarios vary, but in the Philippines, if you stopped and gave her a ride, she would silently enter your back seat. If you don't interact with her, she'll leave you alone until she eventually disappears from your car some distance later. If you see her on the road and keep driving, she will suddenly appear in your car and attack you. The moral is, it's better to give her a ride than not. When we arrived at my uncle's large house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge had somehow directly affected me. After a delicious dinner and a round of video games with my cousins, I found my uncle out on the balcony, having a drink. He offered me a beer, since I was finally old enough, and I took a seat next to him. "Hey, Tito, do you remember anything about that bridge right outside of town?" He put his drink down and regarded me for a few moments. He cut straight to the chase. You were very young when it happened. I suppose you didn't remember it much. Now I was fully intrigued. I had to know. What exactly happened? His warm smile faded, and he told his tale. As the story went on, the memories began to flood my mind. Memories that I had long since repressed as a defense mechanism. All the details came to me in excruciating clarity, as if it only happened yesterday. By the time he finished the story, there was no denying it. I had indeed encountered a ghost all those years ago. It was the mid-90s, and I was still living in the Philippines. I was a plucky 6-year-old that was all about adventuring and exploring. Once or twice a week I would spend the night at my uncle's farm. Back then, a small budding business. The town it was in was smaller then, fairly remote. I loved that place because there were so many areas to explore, but only in the daytime. One particular night, I was over at his place, just watching TV. My uncle got a call of a new delivery of chicken feed that needed to be picked up in the next town. At the time, he only had a few farmhands and they all had the night off. Usually he wouldn't make a supply run this late at night, but he was behind schedule and needed to pick up the supplies or risk losing profit. As he headed out, he asked me if I wanted to tag along. Ever the restless child, I immediately agreed. My uncle had an old Toyota SUV that he used for all his delivery pickups. I sat in the second row, my usual spot, while my uncle slid into the driver's seat. Most of the voyage was uneventful. It was nearly 11 p.m. at night, so there was hardly any other vehicles on the road. Upon crossing the bridge the first time, nothing happened. During that time, the bridge was newly constructed. It was only put up the year before, after the original bridge had been ravaged by the last typhoon. The city even put up streetlights on the new bridge for better visibility. That was a huge deal, since none of the other surrounding roads even had streetlights at all. We arrived at the next town and I helped my uncle load up the supplies. Well, as much as a small 6-year-old can help. On the way back home was when it happened. I was sitting in the back seat, absent-mindedly looking out the window, when I felt the car slow down. We were almost at the bridge, and I noticed that something was not right. I was too small to see over the seat and out the windshield, but I could tell that all the lights on the bridge were off. At this point, the car slowed to a crawl. "Hey, why don't you lie down and take a little nap?" my uncle said from the front. Something in his voice didn't sound right. It sounded like he was scared and struggling to hide it. "No, that's okay. I'm not tired. Please, just do it for me, okay?" He sounded stern but measured. My uncle was usually an easygoing guy, so when he got serious, you know you should pay attention. "Okay," I said, as I laid down on the seat sideways. I briefly saw my uncle's eyes in the rearview mirror. They showed unmistakable fear. I felt the familiar bump that signaled that we were now on the bridge. Then the car stopped. Close your eyes, okay? No matter what, keep them closed. Okay? I started to get scared. I didn't know what was happening or why I had to close my eyes. Regardless, I shut them tight. Then, the strangest thing happened. My uncle began to sing. It was a traditional Filipino folk song. I had only heard it once before. About a year ago, my aunt and uncle got into a shouting match, as in a things were thrown across the room type of shouting match. I was at their house at the time, and my cousins and I stayed in their room, cowering and waiting for the storm to pass. An hour later, my uncle entered the room and apologized for the shouting, and then he started to sing that song to lull us off to sleep. The melody was beautiful, and I'd never known my uncle could sing that well. He never did it again. At least, not until that moment, when we were on that dark bridge. The song sounded just as beautiful, but I could tell his voice was shaking. His car wasn't that big, but I was a small child, and there was a lot of room in that second row. I was lying down on the seat perpendicular to the windows, trying and hoping for sleep to come. Instead, something else did. Click, click. I heard the familiar mechanism of the headlights flashing. All of a sudden, I sensed that I was not alone in that second row anymore. My spatial awareness of the car told me that someone was sitting right next to me. We had gained another passenger. I shut my eyes even tighter as my uncle began to drive. The temperature inside the car became cold. I curled myself into a ball, seeking refuge from whatever it was that was now right next to me. I didn't know much about ghosts and supernatural creatures at that age, and though I couldn't see it, something told me that I was in the presence of something not of this world. My uncle finished that song and started over again. I was amazed that he was able to keep his composure. Me, I refused to open my eyes. I could hear her, so uncomfortably close next to me. At first, I heard what sounded like clicking. As it increased in volume, it sounded like stalks of celery being twisted and broken. Crack, 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 crack. It was unnerving. Those sounds were not normal. They were all around me. Finally, we crossed over the bridge, but she was still there. I was so scared I could barely move. The car hit a bump, which caused me to slide over the other side, closer to her. I could feel damp cloth against my leg. My breaths became shallow, and I started to cry. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I opened my eyes just for a split second. In that split second, I saw her. A brief flash of white with stringy, damp hair, blacker than night. She was turned away from me. I blinked the tears from my eyes. When I opened them again, that mass of black hair was right in front of my face. I shut my eyes tight again. After what seemed like an eternity, the car hit a familiar curve on the road that signaled the entrance into our town. I felt that entity come even closer to me. By this time, my uncle was silent. No more songs. The air became even colder, right next to my face, and I shook. Not from the cold, but from terror. And then, she spoke, right into my ear. It was a hushed whisper, lower than any whisper I've ever heard. I couldn't make out what she said. It didn't sound threatening or angry. It sounded sad. And then, she was gone. I immediately felt the difference. I could no longer feel another presence in the car, and the air went from cold to tropical humid again. I heard my uncle breathe a sigh of relief. I did not open my eyes until we had reached the safety of the farm. My uncle had to carry me back inside and straight into my bed, and only then did I open my eyes. From what I could recall, we never spoke of that night to anyone, not even each other, ever again. Subsequent trips across that bridge at night never resulted in any more white lady sightings. At least, not for me. I would find out later that, in the early 80s, a woman was found dead at the bottom of that bridge. People said that she was travelling to the next town and was hoping to catch a ride with any passing vehicles. It was late at night and she had no family nearby that could give her a ride. No one knows what really happened, but many suspected that it was murder. After my trip back to the Philippines, I couldn't stop thinking about that night at the bridge. How could I forget such an incredible and terrifying experience? I guess it doesn't matter since I remember it now. But there was something else I realized about that night. Something that I did not remember before. When I heard her whisper, I thought that I had only heard unintelligible garble. But that's not true. She did say something. She said, "Maraming salamat." Translated to English, that means, "Thank you very much."